want to say it's a privilege to be here with some of the incredible speakers tonight. There is someone I want you to hear before you hear me, a voice that never failed to command attention, the voice of my father, Tony McMahon. Dad was a sports broadcaster in Limerick City for 27 years, and his specialist subject was horse racing. Each year he covered the Cheltenham Festival. Each year he would pick his choice for the biggest race of the week, the Gold Cup. For the third consecutive year, he tipped the Michael Harrigan-trained beef for salmon. Now, trust me, it doesn't matter if you don't know anything about horse racing. I just ask that you listen to him, his words. I want you to hear him.
It's beef for salmon's third attempt to win the Gold Cup. Now, he had a bad fall at Cheltenham 2 years ago. I was there, and it was very, very disappointing because Michael Horrigan, even though the horse was a novice, thought he was going to win the Gold Cup with him. Last year, he was off the track for a considerable period as well because of an injury, that injury he sustained when falling. He was off the track for a considerable period because of that injury. He still managed, they got him right towards the end, and he still managed to finish fourth behind best mate, despite an interrupted preparation. Now, this year he's looked like a world beater when he won the Lexus at Christmas, and then he disappointed in the Heineken a couple of months later. That Heineken run was solved by the vet. Horrigan has had the horse scoped just last weekend, and the offending bugs have apparently disappeared. And he did a last piece of training with the horse in Greenmount Park before he set off for Cheltenham. And the word coming back from that outing in Greenmount is that the horse has never looked and has never seemed as good. So I think that Beef for Salmon has an outstanding chance. He needs a bit of luck in running, but what he does have is tremendous pace. I can see him sitting off behind a couple of horses and keeping his best efforts until they start to hit the hill. He'll come up that hill, no problem at all. He has buckets of pace, and I guarantee you, if there are 2 or 3 with him, he'll burn them off.
Well, sadly for many punters, including myself, Beef for Salmon didn't win the Gold Cup. But as Dad used to always say, winning races is an inexact science, as so many things are. I didn't know it for many years, but this was one of the last times my father ever spoke on radio. That was March 18, 2005. 3 weeks later, he was diagnosed with early onset Alzheimer's at the age of 58. He had Alzheimer's when he gave this interview. No one knew. When many people try to imagine what Alzheimer's is, they don't imagine this. They imagine people who are missing or losing parts of themselves. They imagine they have the ability to see it, to hear it. You don't hear that when you hear Tony because you can't. You can't hear that Tony couldn't read a clock. You can't hear that Tony shoved unpaid bills into drawers at home because he didn't know what to do with them anymore. You can't hear that he often trailed off mid-sentence or that he couldn't make a cup of coffee. You can't hear that he was running red lights or driving on the right-hand side of the road. And I'm sure you can't hear that Tony knows that something is wrong, that something had been wrong for years. Because 3 weeks after that, he told his own doctor that he'd been experiencing memory problems for 3 years. You hear someone who challenges the myriad of common misconceptions associated with Alzheimer's because you hear nothing. My father's voice was always heard, whether he was on air or not. His voice was the mask Alzheimer's hid behind. His vocabulary would inevitably and cruelly fail him as time went on, but as long as he could shuck and jive with pals for pints after work on the first Friday of every month, which was tradition, and croon a Frank Sinatra song at a sing-along, he was heard. He was heard, but those of us worried about what was happening to him were not heard for a long time. My mother and I not only heard Dad, we saw, because we lived with him. It was Tony's actions that betrayed him, the behaviour of a confused man who seemed stuck that no mask could hide. We were so afraid we found ourselves unable to speak about it to each other. The worse it got, the more isolated from each other we became. I was withdrawn and detached in college. The weight just fell off my mother from the stress. Tony, perhaps out of fear or denial, refused to admit anything to either of us. He hid behind the person you just heard speak. You know who first diagnosed my dad? The internet, Dr. Google. I thought if we typed in his symptoms that we might get some idea of what was wrong. So I used keywords based on what I'd witnessed over the last year. Short-term memory loss, confusion, poor judgment, unable to carry out everyday tasks, and quick as a flash, Google had found sites for me. Unfortunately, every site was linked to Alzheimer's. And 3 pages in, there was nothing but Alzheimer's. And I thought, Dad can't have that, he's only 58. That's an old person's disease. And I bought into this misconception. And if I'm honest, I knew why I did it all along. Not knowing was less scary than even considering it might be Alzheimer's. The first time I ever used the word Alzheimer's was when I tried to tell my mother I'd Googled his symptoms. Now, I really had to build up to that moment, and I couldn't look at her as I told her what I found online. She wasn't buying it either at the time. She replied, her grandmother had it in her late 80s, and that was the response I expected to hear. But the day his doctor requested to speak with her privately and asked her what she thought was wrong, she told him that I had been looking things up. She said one word, Alzheimer's. She didn't look up when she heard the doctor tell her she was right. The first time someone heard my mother and told her she was right, she simply couldn't look at them. The night I learned of his diagnosis, I was in college in Dublin, and I was waiting for my mother to call and tell me what the doctor had told her. She waited until Dad went to bed. I don't really remember anything about that call, other than my mother saying, he has what you thought he had, and I knew what that meant. The word Alzheimer's was never used in that conversation. I don't know if it was a word we ever used in the early stage. If we spoke about it at all, we spoke in whispers and smiled at him as if there was nothing wrong. Telling him would have destroyed him. It just seemed unconscionable at the time to tell a man who valued all that he put into his brain that it would be taken away from him piece by piece as it was. For those who knew and mourned my father, they don't just miss the man or the horse racing tips, the charm, the character, the sense of humour, the songs and that voice. They miss his mind. Lonely is the only word to truthfully describe what it was like to be 19 years of age and find out your parents had an illness you couldn't talk about. I didn't know how to feel or how I was allowed to feel, so I retreated. No one hugged me. No one knew what to say. I didn't know what to say. And college was over after that for me. My heart left the night I learned Dad had Alzheimer's. I had a new job to focus on, a newsreader in the radio station my father had worked for. I looked forward to partnering him on Sunday afternoons as a colleague, but sadly it was not to be. As hard as life became on this meandering path that took us deep into an undiscovered country, those of us who loved my father realised we had a finite amount of time with him, and we made everything of it. When I recall the hardest parts of our journey, I balance them with the memories we made or that I was a part of. I remember our trip to Wales for the Heineken Cup final to see Munster finally win and lift the trophy. Because my dad always said he could die happy once he saw Munster win the Heineken Cup. And luckily for me and him, my mother hadn't taken the credit card off him, so he just handed it to me during the semi-finals and said, "Book it." Whenever I took him to the cinema or a show, he would sing along with the music. And I just let him because it was worth it, even if we were going to be kicked out. I remember the day he called me and told me that I had a niece and her name was Faye, the first grandchild. I remember the first time he held her after he'd whispered to me that he was afraid he'd drop her, but he never did. Every year, my mother held a birthday party for him for the rest of his life. While he could, he went off with friends or former colleagues for coffee or to the races with his brothers. He lost that voice, but he never lost the love of music. and one could almost see a part of him sing as we played his favourite songs. Today, 6 years on after his passing, he is remembered for the impact he had on so many lives and for the beautiful memories that he left us, and for that voice. My mother once said, Alzheimer's changed everything. It changed the trajectory of my life at 19 years of age. It challenged my fear because I had no choice but to learn what it was and learn its language, so I could understand what was happening to my dad and more recently my grandmother, who was diagnosed last year and who we both care for. Alzheimer's changed me as a person, and sometimes I don't know how to feel about that. Who might I have been if Dad was never diagnosed? Yet 13 years on, I don't think so much about what I lost. I think about what I was given. A voice that is finally heard. Thank you very much.